All right, welcome back. We're taking you on this virtual tour of our watershed for Giving Week, our November or now December Giving Week. I have my hand over my ear to cover the microphone because it is super windy out. But we are at a very important part of our watershed. So you first joined us on Lake Okeechobee, and so we were at the headwaters, and now where we're at is we're almost halfway through the watershed. We're just outside of the Everglades agriculture area, which is where all the farming, as the name implies, is going. And we are at one of many spillways. So this is one spillway. Just on the other side of this levee is Southern Boulevard and the C-51 Canal. And then to my right, or your left, is what we call the stormwater treatment area. And it's important to note that on that side, so those three canals that I mentioned from Lake Okeechobee, they come together. They eventually all join into the C-51, which is right there, which goes towards the Lake Worth Lagoon, of course. But this spillway and many others around us, and also you can't see it here, but the other side of those trees is probably the most impressive structure in all of the Everglades. It's called the S5A. It's a really big pump. It's a giant water pump that is powered by, I think, 6 vintage submarine engines. These things are ginormous. It's a really impressive structure. It can move a lot of water very quickly when needed, and it's a structure that's studied by engineers and people who do water management all around the world because it really is that impressive. And it's critically important because what that pump does and working with these spillways is it's moving that water from Lake Okeechobee through the EAA, and that water is going into the STA first. The STA, which stands for Stormwater Treatment Area, and once Alex starts talking, we'll take you over the ridge where it's really windy, and we'll show you what that looks like. But the very oversimplification of what an STA is it's an artificial wetland. And just like how we talked about, it's really important to manage the Lake Okeechobee at the right level so that those plants can live in the lake, so that those plants can clean the water. That is what the South Florida Water Management District is doing with the STAs. The plants that exist in the STAs, and it's a shallower water body, water gets moved in there, those plants clean that water, all the agriculture runoff, all of that legacy pollution from Lake Okeechobee, that gets cleaned up in the STA to a point where it gets acceptable and meets our standards to send that water south towards the southern Everglades, Florida Bay, so on and so forth. But every once in a while, that can't happen, and that's where it becomes a problem for the Lake Worth Lagoon. That every once in a while, for whatever reason, there's a multitude of reasons, the STAs might be at capacity, or like over the last like a couple years ago, they were under construction because they were being fixed. Sometimes there's just too much water. Sometimes the plants aren't as effective, or there aren't as many as we need in there. A multitude of reasons. Sometimes we can't send that water into the STA, which then goes into what we call Water Conservation Area 1, which is also known as the Arthur R. Marshall Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. And if you look at a map of Palm Beach County, it's a really big teardrop-shaped green area. You can't miss it. It's a really large wetland of a couple 100,000 acres. It's absolutely beautiful. You should always, I always encourage people to visit there. And that beauty, that nature, that refuge, and just like the rest of the Everglades, we want to protect it. So we don't want to send polluted water into that refuge or the southern Everglades because it would ruin it. So that's what the STAs are here to do. It's kind of like a pre-filter to clean that water before we send it south. But if we can't send it south, another time that this happens is like during a hurricane or the weeks leading up to the hurricane. We need to lower the lake. We need to lower all the canals to get ready for all that rain we're going to take on. Because like I pointed out before, the primary mission of the South Florida Water Management District and these canals is to make sure that our communities are not flooded out. Because before these canals, we would be standing on a wetland right now. We would be standing in water. just like the Southern Everglades. But in order to keep us dry, this whole system needs to work together to make sure that we're not flooded out. But sometimes, if we can't send that water south, what ends up happening is these gates and the others like it close, and all of that water from the EAA and all of that water from Lake Okeechobee skips going south and goes directly towards the Lake Worth Lagoon. And that is super problematic because we know that there's a lot of inputs of pollution throughout that watershed. Remember how Alex pointed out the input ratio is 42 to 1. So that means for every square kilometer of water body of Lake Worth Lagoon, there's 42 of watershed of the land that drains into the lagoon. And that's really drastic. So to put that into perspective, Biscayne Bay, which includes all of the Miami metropolitan area, and as physically large as that place is, the bay is much bigger water body, so the input ratio is about 11 to 1. Indian River Lagoon, obviously the lagoon is a ginormous water body, that's about 5 to 1. So 42 to 1, we have a lot draining into a small cup of water, right? So when this water from the EAA and from Lake Okeechobee water is definitely the most problematic because it has, over 100 years of legacy pollution that when we start discharging it sends it our way. So if we can't send the water actually south to Southern Everglades, it goes directly to the Lake Worth Lagoon, and it does so without that pre-filter. So we're drinking it straight from the tap, straight with all that pollution, and that has led to some pretty significant problems in the Lake Worth Lagoon, such as seagrass loss, cyanobacteria blooms, other harmful algae blooms, red tide, you name it, we can be subjected to it. It's not the only source of pollution in the agriculture industry. There is research that points out west of here is where most of our pollution comes from. And then, of course, as you go downstream, which we'll show you on later on today, you have endless suburbia and urban areas, which adds in its own amount of pollution from septic tanks, from leaking sewer systems, and the runoffs from our roads and our yards, so on and so forth. And eventually, it ends up in the Lake Worth Lagoon, where Alex is right now.
Hi guys, I am at Spillway Park right now. You can, let's see the spillway behind me. Nope, this way. There we go. So the spillway is closed right now, but that behind those walls, there is the freshwater, the C51 canal. So that's what Ronaldo is talking about. That where he's at right now, that water that doesn't get sent south will get sent through that canal. If you ever drive along Southern Boulevard, that's actually the one that you can see going right along the road. That's the C51, and it comes out here. I'm right at the border of Lake Worth and West Palm Beach. So this is a little park. You can actually come visit and see the spillway. People come fish here. If you fish on my side, you will be fishing in brackish water. If you fish on the other side, you'll be fishing in freshwater. So it's kind of an interesting and sort of amazing structure that separates these two water bodies. The plants and like the wildlife on this side is completely different. I'm standing under like sea grapes, and there's little mangroves growing around me. If you go on that side, it's all like apple snails and freshwater mussels. So it's pretty amazing that just the single spillway is what's keeping these two water bodies apart. But when that spillway is open, and I think Ronaldo and Melissa, I think you guys are going to end here, so I won't talk too much. I'm sure Ronaldo has lots of really good, more detailed information about it. But obviously when the spillway is open, fresh water is coming in, and they can open it to varying degrees. So sometimes it's like fully open and it's like, it looks like a little mini waterfall coming in. Sometimes it's open just a little bit, and you're just getting a little bit of that fresh water coming in. But that obviously changes the salinity of this area, and then heading out into the lagoon, which, as I mentioned before, you do need some freshwater input into an estuary ecosystem. It's not the ocean, right? It's usually the ocean is anywhere between, I think, 30 to 35 parts per thousand salinity. And usually estuary, you want it to be less than that. While the wildlife that does live in an estuary is extremely adapted, right? They have to be adapted to really dynamic conditions. Even in like a perfectly natural estuary, you might get a hurricane, and then you get like a huge influx of fresh water. So the organisms that live in those environments have to be able to adapt to low salinity, high salinity, and those like that fluctuating salinity in between. But normally when that happens, you get a lot of like rain in the lagoon, but then you would get more fresh water falling on the land, trickling back down into the lagoon. It's more of a um, like it's happening over time versus when the spillway is open, you are just getting, and I'm sure Ronaldo has a better idea of the volume, but you're getting a much larger, much more concentrated volume of fresh water. And that can change the salinity really, really, really fast, which is harder for the organisms to adjust to. And so that can cause a lot of problems, especially for filter feeding organisms like oysters. A sudden change in salinity can be really, really damaging. And so, as Ronaldo mentioned, the South Florida Water Management District, they're here to make sure that we're not getting flooded, but they're not necessarily managing the water in terms of what's best for the ecosystem. And so that's why you end up getting these types of situations where, yes, it's good to lower the canals, it's good to lower the lake. We don't want those communities getting flooded. But because we don't have the natural wetlands that would be able to take that fresh water and kind of filter it back into the estuary the way it's meant to be, then we rely on these types of structures to really manage the fresh water, and it's not great for the environment in that way. Again, with the input ratio the way it is, not only are we getting a large input of fresh water that's changing the salinity, but we're also getting a large input of not very clean water. And again, for those filter feeding organisms like oysters, that can be really not great for them. So I don't want to talk too much because I know that you guys are going to end here. But it's actually a really cool park. If you guys get a chance to come visit, it's worth a visit just to see, like, this is an important point in our watershed. And it's kind of amazing to see it. So yeah, I'll check back in with you guys at a different point in the watershed. I'm making my way north. So we'll be getting up into like some of the more natural areas. And I'll talk to you guys then.
Thank you, Alex. And, like you can see here, Alex made a really good point that when we're managing the water for flood protection, that has historically been the priority. And one of the big things that we do as an organization, and we're not alone, there's so many other organizations that we work with, like Friends of the Everglades and Sierra Club, and all these, other environmental organizations that we work hard to improve that policy, right? One of the core work that we do as an organization is policy reform. Well, what exactly does that mean? That means that we are looking to change, not just laws, but any kind of government regulation or rule or work policy, whatever it may be, to better, make better decisions as a community as a whole, so that we can work to fix our water. Alex made a great point that when the water is managed with flood protection as a priority, environment is kind of like a secondary issue for it, right? We need to protect our flooding, and then here, like for example, this STA, it's actually a really good spot if you're into birding. It's a bit windy now, so I'm not seeing a whole lot of birds, but we did see quite a bit on the walk over. And that kind of just happens by accident, right? Like the district built this artificial wetland, and then the birds will come as just kind of like an added bonus cherry on top. But there are ways that we can design these types of projects in these areas where we're intentionally making it a better environment as well, not just, it'll do to flood protection, it'll do to water cleaning, but we should also prioritize the environment aspect of as well. So we're making our way over as well, going along the C51 canal. It's a really large watershed, as we pointed out, so there's a lot to look at. And the access point of where we were at, this levee, there's actually a really cool little park, if you will, or parking lot off of Southern Boulevard, right across the street from the Arden community, where you can go and walk out here and see a bunch of birds. We saw a bunch of, I think we saw some anhinga, some great blue heron, a whistling duck on the way over here, quite a few. And on a nice calm day, it's generally a lot better. But yeah, so we'll work our way down and continue to see what we see. I guess the next stop or something to factor in as we make our way east, we might not stop there, but along Southern Boulevard and 441, there's that Lowe's right there. And there's a small but unassuming structure right next to that Lowe's that we call the S155A. And that is a spillway that goes completely across the C51, and that structure is the true dividing structure of our watershed. So west of there is the EAA and Loxahatchee and Arden and so on. East of there is, of course, West Palm Beach, Lake Worth, all those communities east. And that structure is the hard deciding structure that decides whether or not the Lake Worth Lagoon takes on Lake Okeechobee or EAA water. That is kind of the turning point, if you will. So, once again, recap, we're at the STA right now, stormwater treatment area. This is where the water makes its way south towards the Everglades. It's what we always advocate for. If you'll hear us in many groups say, send the water south, clean it up and send it south. And this is where that happens, right here. So thanks for joining us, and we will catch up with you along the way.